All right, folks, PowerPoint is back up. Wipe the sweat off my forehead. In just about 30 seconds here, I'll get started. I see a couple people still joining in, so I wanted to make sure everybody has a couple moments to get used to logging into Zoom.
Eric, I see that we have people not only throughout the United States here in New York, but we even have some international guests on the line.
Wow. Wow, those are some cheap tickets to come join us here. I love it. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully the time difference works out in a pleasurable fashion. Wow, this is great. Thank you all for joining us. Oh, thank you, Jacob. Okay, I think the participant numbers are slowing down, so I think it's time to get started. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited about today. This is really a very exciting thing for me to be able to combine one of the things that I love, which is business incubation, as well with my partner in creating this program, Ari Huffnung, who I will introduce later. We just really want to thank you for joining us to learn and discuss entrepreneurship in New York State cannabis. I can hear all the applause right now. This is how we applaud in the Zoom world. But I just want you to know we are recording this. Just so that you know, all of our guests, for some reason on Zoom webinar, it doesn't allow your faces. So don't worry, your faces will not be shared. But once all these sessions are recorded, we are going to share them with you. So we will figure out the best method of doing that. But yes, these videos will be accessible to the public. Also, just maybe it's being a little over secure, but every Friday, I am going to email everybody with the newest registration login for the following session, just so it doesn't really get out there that long, and also another pleasantry of Zoom webinar. So I appreciate you fielding all of my emails throughout the week. Really, our goal today or throughout these 4 sessions is to provide you the tool and the knowledge that it will take you to help apply for your licensure and grow your startup. Yes, there's going to be all sorts of fun puns today, such as grow, but that is really our goal. It's to educate, it's to give to you, and to help foster entrepreneurship in New York State. So let's get started. Let me first introduce you to the organization that I work for. This is the Kauffman Incubator, as we call it, or the Kauffman Southern Tier Incubator. We're located in upstate New York in Broome County, or Binghamton specifically. We opened in April of 2017, so we are a startup ourselves. And in fact, I have a giant business model canvas of this incubator's business model in my office that I'm constantly trying to innovate. We have 65 startup members. It's incredible. 10 international companies. And really one of the most amazing facts that I feel privileged or inclined to brag about on behalf of our companies. But over this last year, our companies raised $118 million during 2021. So very proud of all of those companies. And it's just, it's an amazing company. If you want to learn more about the Kauffman Incubator, just go to thekauffman.com. Oh gosh, that's me. Well, I am the Director of Business Incubation Programming at Binghamton University, located at the Kauffman Incubator. I was blessed to be able to take a master class on building invincible companies by Strategizer. We're going to learn a little bit more about those folks on the next slide. but they are the creators of the business model canvas. Since then, I've been able to speak nationally and internationally on the different segments of the business model canvas. Long time ago, I guess, started this area's first CBD company and as well as exited. And that's really kind of where I got my first education in the cannabis sector. However, I think that the CBD markets are a lot different than what's about to happen here in New York. But before any of that, I actually started as a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America down in Hyde Park. And some odd years later, became a clinical dietitian. You can see the duality there. And I was lucky enough to be a dietitian in both geriatrics as well as in the HIV and AIDS population. Both of those careers have made me so rich in soul points. I'm absolutely blessed to have had that. And somehow through all that work, I was able to create a couple different patents, one for my company, Gyro Heat Technologies, and another for a company I created called Be Safe. But enough about me. Let's keep going. I'm not why you're here. Let's talk about this business model canvas. So the two gentlemen that you see a photo of, the man wearing the red shirt is Alex Osterwalder. And when Alex was in school, studying under the other gentleman seen here, Yves Pigneur, he decided to take this document we call the business plan. I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar have heard of that awful term. I absolutely hate business plans. You get to page 80 and then realize you have to start the whole thing over because something has changed. And he said, you know what? What if I take this 80-page, 200-page document and turn it into a graphic? Now, amazingly, a lot of people laughed at him and he said, that's completely that's impossible. You can't do that. And he persisted and worked with his professor, worked with the other, one of the most brilliant minds in business, David Bland. And they were able to actually create this visual tool that we call the business model canvas. So here it is. This is the business model canvas. It is a 9-segment tool that helps us build our business model. So there's a lot of things going on here. I'm going to try to explain them simply, and we're going to get more complicated as these sessions progress. But these 9 segments can be viewed, first of all, in 3 different categories. Desirability. Do people desire what it is that I'm trying to sell? Feasibility. Can you actually do it though? Can you really deliver? And viability. Does it make economical sense? And so by answering the 3 of these things, I think we're able to actually give people the power or the insight to be competitive. So that is why for this program, I knew it was an absolute must that we continue to teach people the business model canvas so that you can use this tool as all of you start to design your future business. Another thing that's really amazing about this is simple words or even pictures are the best answers for each segment. We're going to learn more about that later, but it does not require sentences or paragraphs. And in fact, that really messes things up. The knowledge behind what word or image you use is really where a lot of the work comes from, but it's really meant to be very simple. And it's what I call a living document in that it should be constantly changed. You should actually never write on one of these things. I mean, I make a PowerPoint version and, you can just erase things, but, I have about 10 different colored Post-it notes. And that's what I use to fill in the answers on this. Because when something changes, all I do is move the Post-it note off and leave it on the wall and decide what should replace it. Unlike the business plan, where often one change requires a lot of time in changing a very long document. So another way of looking at this, and I do come from somewhat of a theatric family, but a lot of us refer to this as the theater of the BMC. So let me show you what I mean by this. We have the back of the house, right? So there's back of a house of a theater. There's a back of the house of the business model canvas. This is all about basically how do we provide value to our customers. So every business usually will have to rely on key partners, right? We need to be able to grow with other businesses so that we have this symbiotic relationship with each other, and it allows us to grow ahead bigger and faster at a lower cost or a faster time. So key partners are always vital. Key activities. What are those activities in your daily business that you need to either amplify or figure out better ways of doing it, or just keep doing it and understand that that's a cost? So we have to identify what are those key activities that it takes to continue to provide that value to your customers. And then key resources. This is always probably, in my opinion, the most important one as a startup. What key resources do you have available to you or through your community or through partners or friends that really give you that unique advantage over your competitors? Or maybe it's just a reason why this business model can't fail because I just have this ultimate key resource. Well, we have to identify these things. And when you put all these things together, it creates the back of the house. This is what makes it so that we can actually provide that theater show to our customers. And what would a theater be without our customers? So we have a front of the house. And when we look at this section, what we're going to talk about here is customer segments. So all of us want to, create this business and sell to the entire world, because why not? They're going to love what we make. But in actuality, as a startup, we need to find that beachhead market or that customer segment that wants what you're selling more than anybody else because they've been asking for it for years. They're begging you to take your money. That's the customer segment that we want to find. Now, what they want is the value proposition. So we have to realize that people don't just want things. We don't just go to a coffee shop on the way to work because we want coffee. In fact, what we really want is the value out of that coffee, which might be showing up to work and being bright-eyed and ready to work and get right to it. Or maybe we didn't have breakfast because we missed it because we were too busy and I need something to keep going. There's an emotional value behind every customer's decision to pay you for something. So we have to identify that. Customer relationships, extremely important. How do you as a business communicate to your customers? What keeps them to continually doing business with you as opposed to shopping around or going someplace else? So we have to identify, how do our customers want to have a relationship with our company? How do they relate to us? How do they want to continue having that relationship with us? And then finally, channels, right? So are you selling online? Are you selling in person? Do you have delivery? Is it a drone or a horse that delivers your stuff? Maybe it's one of my giant puppies back here that can deliver it on a backpack. I don't know. You get to pick. But this is the front of the house. This is why the customer wants to do business with us, because they're receiving something, they're interacting with us, and it really is the heart of our business. And then lastly, the ticket booth. That one I actually did make up. What is a theater without a ticket booth, right? There's no theater that's able to put on a nice big production, offer you the exact thing that you came there to experience, and then doesn't charge anything, right? We can't do that. We have to pay people. So in there, we have to look at cost structure. What are all the different things that cost us money? So a lot of this could be, the channels that we choose to get to our customers. Maybe some cost more than others. Or maybe there's key activities that are just costing us too much time or too much money to be able to continue. So these are the things we have to kind of look at in cost structure. Revenue streams, now that's one of my favorite things to talk about. I mean, who doesn't like to talk about revenue, right? That's how we make money. But in there's so much more than just saying, I charge this much for this product and I charge that much for that product. There's actual ways of constructing your business model that will make more sense when it comes to making revenue. And what I mean by that is maybe some things you sell on a monthly reoccurring basis and other things you sell, just as it comes. Maybe it's more expensive. So there's all these different pricing models or pricing schemes that really should be focused on how does your customer want to actually pay for what you're selling. So very important to look at that ticket booth. I have worked with many companies where the desire for their product was huge. People wanted it, they loved it, the value was there. The key partners, activities, resources, man, they were spot on. They were even getting products for the raw material for free. So totally nailed that. But when it came to viability, and we really worked out what are people making at the end of the day after all this work when they sell their product, and it came out to like, a couple dollars an hour. Well, that's not viable. So viability is incredibly important. So let me summarize this real quick. We have desirability, we have feasibility, and then we have viability. So again, desirability is that customer development. Who are our customers? One of the best ways, and this is not my creation, but one of the best ways to really learn about your future customers, go and watch them. If I wanted to make a coffee shop, I would want to go sit down in coffee shops that were similar to maybe what I wanted to, or maybe had the same customer segments. And I would just sit and watch and maybe make a journal. What is it that these customers are trying to do while they're purchasing? What is it that they really desire? What kind of pain can we fix for this customer? And that's how we're going to develop this desirability or customer segments. Then we have feasibility, right? Build, borrow, buy. I don't know about you. I feel like this section is going to be one of the most important sections when it comes to cannabis in New York State. It's not going to be incredibly cheap to do most things, right? So we have to figure out, are you able to build yourself? Are you going to have to borrow, or do you buy, right? Is it feasible to achieve our dream? And then viability, the sanity check, right? Okay, look, everything else works out. People love it. They want it. There's enough people to buy it. I can do the build, borrow, and buy all together. We have great partnerships. But man, are we going to make enough money, or are we going to pay the investors, or all those things? Again, we have to make sure that we're on top of that, and we're making sure that, okay, yes, it is sane for me to try to get into this. Good, sanity check over. So with that said.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
Let me just jump in here with a question. So we have, over 100 cannabis entrepreneurs on the Zoom right now. And I think many are going to be pursuing license opportunities here in New York, and many are going to be fundraising. And typically with fundraising, you need a business plan to fundraise, to present to investors, to talk to them about your business. Does the business model canvas that, people at the Kauffman Incubator and around the world use, does that come before the business plan or after the business plan, or is it a substitute for the business plan? How should we be thinking of it?
That's a great question. All right, thank you. My opinion, start with the business model canvas first, because it's so easy to change. If you're able to answer each of these 9 segments, then you're able to write however many pages on each of these things for that business plan. So in my experience so far, banks still require the business plan. A few of them are progressively switching to the business model canvas, but they are still at the plan. So it is good to use. And there's free resources out there to help you write business plans, such as the Small Business Development Center. But nonetheless, I prefer to always do things in a quicker, cheaper, better fashion. So if you are able to learn the business model canvas and truly answer all of these 9 segments, then these are the 9 segments that have to be answered for any business, just like the business plan is going to ask you to do. But here, at least, you can work things out without having to spend major time in making changes. So absolutely, this is where I would start. And there's so many free resources out there. Besides our own workshops, you can just go online and YouTube Strategizer, if you will, or anyone else. David Bland has his own series on the business model canvas. But yes, because of the fact that it's just so easy to change, that's why I love to start with the business model canvas first. But great question. Thank you very much for that. And again, if anyone else has any questions on this, please throw it in the chat. We're going to try to get everything answered if possible. So just moving on, slightly slower, but next week, we're going to enter session two, excuse me, and really looking at key activities and resources. So basically that back of the house. And what I hope that you get out of that is really thinking about what are the things we need to do to prepare ourselves for creating the business that we dream about. What are the resources? Who are the people that we should partner with? And basically, what are those activities that we have to start doing today in order for us to be successful tomorrow? With that said, I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us. We are going to have a 5-minute break in a few minutes, but I wanted to allow any questions that anyone has. I will say that I have about 15 companies all in a folder. I often use the business model canvas just to kind of map out what I think a cool business would be. And if it works out that that I like it, then maybe move forward. But in most cases, they're just exercises. So they're wonderful things to just store for another day. But I see some questions here. Let me answer a couple of these. Thank you so much. Dr. Aiken asks, good evening. Would this PowerPoint be made available to attendees per request? Absolutely. Why not? I don't see why not. I'd love to share this information. What segment does value from John? Thank you, John. What segment does value propositions belong to? Let me go back real quick and show you. It, in fact, has its own segment. And in fact, the relationship between value propositions and customer segments is so powerful that there's even a second canvas called a value proposition canvas that allows people to really get into the psychology of what am I providing, and is it fixing a pain? Is it adding an advantage or some sort of benefit to that customer? And how and when do they actually want to buy what I'm selling? So the great thing about this canvas is that it's used widely on students studying business, but it's also used by all the Fortune 500 companies. This canvas is for all skill levels. And one point I really want to make about this is it's just not advisable to start a business blindly. So in my opinion, it makes way more sense to design structure in your startup by learning the business model canvas. The next step would be emulate a model of a successful business. That's absolutely what we teach. If there's a business model that you love because that company is just rocking it, well, try to do the same. The next step would be innovating on that model. And that's when you really get to pull yourself away as being a unique competitor. But it really all starts with starting your own structure through the business model canvas.
Eric, and I see
Uh,
we have another question from Patricia here, Patricia Patton. Can I easily apply these principles to an ancillary membership cannabis business? And I guess put another way, is the business model canvas specific to any industry? And what have you seen in terms of the companies that you help incubate at the Kauffman Incubator? Could people use this across industries?
Yeah, great question, Patricia. Thank you, Ari. This canvas can be used. I've used this with battery manufacturing companies at the Kauffman. I've used this with artists. I've used this with social media influencers. It all works the same. I do have two caveats. So in agriculture, my friends at the Cornell Co-op actually have a slightly different version of this that really is focused on agricultural business. And then for nonprofits, there is actually something called the mission model canvas. I will say I actually have not worked with that one myself. I've used it. I've seen it, that is, in practice. But with that, they're really, any company can use this. I've even worked with a lawyer recently who's working on trying to do some more exciting things with her business model. So yes, it is actually very universal. Okay, I want to make sure we keep on time. So we are going to do a 5-minute break to allow people to stretch, get your notepads ready for the next panel, and we will return at exactly 6:05. So thank you so much, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. Okay, hi everyone. I'm just jumping in real quick. I just want to remind everybody here that on Friday I will be emailing everybody that registered with the needed link for the following session. So just if you haven't received a link by Saturday, please feel free to email me and I'll get that right out to you. So thank you so much. Okay, I think we're going to keep the show going here. I am very honored to introduce my friend and my partner on creating this program, Ari Hafnung. I will joke and say that I reviewed my bio slide probably 50 times to try to fluff it up, not lie, but just make it look as good as possible. My friend Ari here is absolutely as amazing as he is kind, and I'm just very honored that he's joining us. So with that, my friends, I introduce you to Ari.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, and thank you to the Kauffman Incubator for hosting this absolutely wonderful program. We're now at the cannabis component of the evening. So the 4 sessions, as Eric previously discussed, we're going to start out with the business model canvas, which as a lifelong entrepreneur, I think is a terrific framework, a terrific model to trying to conceptualize your business plan. And then we're going to move on to more cannabis specific questions and issues. I encourage everybody to use the Q&A function. I've tried to answer a couple great questions which were asked in the interim. I see some more questions are coming through now, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can today. And let me first start by sharing a little bit about my own backgrounds with you. I did not grow up thinking that I'd be working in the cannabis industry, and that certainly is something that I only came to later in life, and I suspect that that is the case for many of you. I am speaking to you from New York City. I live in the Bronx with my family. I like to brag that I'm a 5th-generation New Yorker and a dad to 3 6th-generation New Yorkers who certainly aren't eligible to buy cannabis yet. They're very young. But by the time they grow up and they're 21 years or older, New York is going to look a lot different than it does now. And just sharing a little of my personal backgrounds with you. I've had the privilege, the honor of serving as the CEO of 2 cannabis companies here in New York. First, Fiorello Pharmaceuticals, which was later acquired by GTI. And for a period of over 5 years working at Vireo Health of New York, which is one of the first of the 10 licensees here in New York. At Vireo, I also served as the chief operating officer of the company, and was on the board of the public company. When I joined Vireo in 2015, we were operating in only in the state of Minnesota, and I was really honored to be part of a small team that helped expand that company nationally. The second state was New York, and Vireo has a wonderful cannabis facility in upstate New York in Fulton County, about an hour northwest out of Albany. And the company took over in 2015 what used to be a juvenile detention facility and transformed it into a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility. And I think that's a much better use for the land and property there. I did a lot of fundraising at Vireo. I had the opportunity to manage just an amazing team of employees really throughout the cannabis supply chain. And in New York, which is not going to be the case in the adult use industry, but in the kind of initial medical cannabis industry, all of the companies needed to be vertically integrated, which is quite a bit to manage. And but that gave me the opportunity to learn different parts of the supply chain. So all of the first 10 companies in New York are really engaged in different parts of are in the entire supply chain from seed to sale. That's a term that we use in the industry, from seed to sale. So we are engaged, Vireo is engaged in growing cannabis, manufacturing cannabis, and then of course selling it at its own dispensaries and other dispensaries throughout the state. I also was one of the founders of the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association. NIGIS is now the president of that group, and that is a forum that brings the different companies together. And in a prior life, I spent 5 years in public service working for the city of New York during the Bloomberg administration. I was the deputy comptroller of the city, so sort of like a deputy CFO role, helping to oversee the city's budget. And before my time in public service, I was on Wall Street as a managing director at Bear Stearns. So did a lot of different things. And I think you'll find that in the cannabis industry. When you meet somebody who is currently working in the cannabis industry, ask them to share their story, ask them to share their background with you, because I think their learnings and all of that. And when the panelists speak this evening, I'm going to invite them to share their background with you as well. One of the things that I find most fascinating about this industry is the really sea change in public opinion. When you think about America today, the United States Senate is literally split 50-50. Right. And on many kind of hot button issues, whether, it's gun rights or abortion or other really important policy issues that impact the lives of people, this country is really has very different approaches and is really split on these issues. And when you look, though, at public opinions on legalizing cannabis, if you ask yourself, what can Republicans and Democrats agree on in general? And today that answer is cannabis. 2/3 of Americans now support legalizing cannabis. And for medical cannabis, it's over 90%. So 2/3 today support adult use cannabis, and even more support medical cannabis. And look at that. Go back a generation, go back to 1969. You would think in 1969, more people might have supported cannabis, but, that was probably just the younger folks. 12% of Americans supported legalizing cannabis. And look how quickly that rose over a generation or so. And now we're at 67. When I joined the cannabis industry, when I started my entrepreneurial journey in cannabis, I would speak to people, I would speak to friends, family members, what are you doing? And I would tell them, well, I'm starting a medical cannabis company in New York. And some of them thought that was a terrific idea, but many of them sort of questioned that decision. But I think 7 years into it, and now in 2021, we're seeing a lot of people from other industries, a lot of talented people come into this industry. There's a lot of opportunities here, and really delighted to see that so many of you have taken time out of your busy schedules. I'm sure for most of you, after a full day of work, to learn more about opportunities in the cannabis industry. And I think there's going to be a phenomenal number of opportunities in the cannabis industry, certainly nationally and here in New York as well. So, we were talking about the sea change in public opinion. This is a map that I borrowed from Rolling Stone, and it was, I used the name of the article, the United States of Weed here. And you can see on this map, if you look at the dark greens, and you can see the state of New York there, those are the adult use states. And if you go to the left side of the map, to the West Coast, you see that real big Western cluster of states are also adult use states, and many in the middle. So 18 states in Washington, D.C. have legalized adult use of cannabis. Many others have legalized medicinal use, so close to New York, where most of us are located. New Jersey and the surrounding states have legalized for adult use. But we also have the state of Pennsylvania, our neighbors there, which they really have a very large and successful medical market. And I think we all anticipate that this map is going to be painted dark green quickly over the years to come. The states that are orange now, I think we're going to see more medical programs emerge. The states that only have medical, we're going to see them migrate to adult use. That has happened in many states, and there's a real shift here in terms of the regulations that surround cannabis. Now, we've talked a lot about the opportunities, but I want to make sure that something's not lost in this conversation, because the war on drugs has taken a significant toll on Americans, and disproportionately on Americans of color. And when we look at the social and economic racial disparities in New York specifically, and I'm sharing data from the ACLU here, or their New York chapter, okay, the likelihood for someone who is Black and Hispanic compared to someone who is white to have been arrested for a marijuana offense in New York is 10x, right? So very seldomly do people who look like me get arrested for cannabis use in New York. And just a few years ago, really not too long ago, unfortunately, the likelihood that Black and Hispanic New Yorkers were going to be arrested for a marijuana offense was extraordinarily high. And this number of the 746,000, which is unfortunately very close to 1 million, is the number of Black and Hispanic New Yorkers that have been arrested during this 18-year observation period. And if you just think about the toll that it has taken on the lives of those individuals, and think of how many people are connected to those individuals. Think of their parents, their siblings, their children, their spouses, their partners. It has really wreaked havoc on entire communities. And where we have really fallen short as an industry is on the ownership side, the diversity of ownership. So right now, one of the, we only have 10 companies, and none of the companies are minority owned. And as Nigist is going to tell you in a few minutes after Jeremy's presentation, the state of New York, I think, is doing everything possible to create the policy framework to get that number up where it should be, to the 50% goal. So I think the lack of diversity we have today is really going to change in the years to come. And there's a lot of opportunities for minority and women business ownership in the cannabis industry. The goal of the cannabis curriculum is to help you become more conversant in the adult use regulations and laws. And Jeremy is going to talk a lot about the legal issues on cannabis. Nigist is going to talk a lot about the policies in New York on cannabis. That's going to be the focus of this evening. And then the next 3 sessions, we're going to walk you through the supply chain so you understand and you can assess for yourself, is the cannabis industry in New York, do I see business opportunities that are right for myself, right? And if so, what are they? Are they cultivation opportunities? Are they processing opportunities? Are they retail opportunities? Is it something ancillary? Is it a delivery service? Is it a security company? Is it a lab testing company? There are a lot of opportunities around here in the industry. And that's really how we created the curriculum. So again, in a few minutes, Jeremy's going to talk about the legal issues. Nigist will talk about the policy issues. A week from today, we're going to focus on the cultivation and processing parts of the supply chain. We're going to have a special guest, one of the leaders in the Senate, in the New York Senate, that is, behind cannabis legislation, Jeremy Cooney from Rochester. Really look forward to welcoming him. We then have retail and marketing, talking about dispensary opportunities and marketing opportunities. We're going to have 2 executives from Curaleaf, which is one of the largest cannabis companies and most successful cannabis companies in the United States today. And then last but not least, we're going to focus on the finances and how do you raise money for a cannabis startup? What does a successful business plan look like? What is a financial model? What type of financial models make sense for this industry? And we're going to have a special guest who's a dear friend, Dr. Kyle Kingsley, who has a great personal story to share about how he became involved in the cannabis industry. So we're running just a few minutes late here, but we've left a little cushion in our schedule. And I am in a moment going to turn it over to Jeremy, and he's going to speak to you guys for about 30 minutes or so on the legal issues. And then we will turn it over to Nigist, who will speak at the policy issues. And then finally, we will have a Q&A where you'll be able to engage with these amazing 2 panelists. But I really invite everyone to use the Q&A function throughout. We're going to try our best to answer live questions that are relevant and really try to respond to as many questions as possible. So we now are moving to the meat of the program, or the main part of the program. And this session is entitled, What Cannabis Entrepreneurs Need to Know About Federal and State Law. And I am absolutely delighted to invite a dear friend and a colleague, Jeremy Unruh, from PharmaCann. He's the Senior Vice President of Public and Regulatory Affairs. We have worked together in the New York industry for what seems to be many years now. And I have learned a lot from him. And I'm going to invite him to take over. But Jeremy, the first question you have to answer tonight for all of our participants is, how in the world does a former prosecutor get into the cannabis industry?
That's a very good question, Ari. Let me do what a good lawyer does and ask you a question in return. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, my friend.
Okay, now is this the best way to do it? You've got the control of the PowerPoint here, and everybody can see me the way they need to see me?
Yes, I'll tell you what, I'm going to pause my share and I'll let you share the PowerPoint so that you could move through the slides at whatever pace makes sense to you.
Okay. So then I need to. Okay, so what I need to do is.
Ari, you might need to stop sharing. There we go.
And I'll present. And then I will share my screen. Okay. I have a disabled attendee screen sharing.
Okay.
All right, try again now.
Okay. And I'll try to share my screen. Okay, perfect. Window, Chrome tab.
Perfect. Here it comes.
You are live, my friend. On mute.
Should just be in the lower left, Jeremy, of your screen. Hopefully you'll see the unmute, or unless the banner's floating somewhere. It should be a Zoom setting.
Okay, now you're unmuted again, Jeremy.
Yeah.
And of course, I would be glad to present.
Here's the crazy issue. As soon as I share my screen and show everybody the PowerPoint, it automatically mutes me on Zoom.
Okay, I apologize.
Why don't you present and I'll just go through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to your question. Let's get back to the meat of things here. So I am a former prosecuting attorney. I'm a lawyer by trade and training, and I spent the first, I guess, 6 years of my career as a prosecutor here in Chicago, from traffic court all the way up through the presiding judge's courtroom of our felony criminal courthouse here in Chicago, the busiest criminal courthouse in the United States by some standards. And my wife turned to me pregnant with our first child, and she said, "Jeremy, it's time that you go get a real job, that you leave the service of the government and go get a real job," which I did. I was a law firm lawyer for about 8 years, where I did a lot of work in products liability defense and in other odious legal activities. And after about 8 years, two of my law partners turned to me and indicated that they had applied for cannabis licenses in the state of Illinois. And if you'll recall, all right, and we can get into some of this, Illinois was not the very first competitive licensing process, but it was one of the very early large scale ones. For, Ari knows better than I do, Minnesota had an earlier competitive application process for cannabis operation licenses. But Illinois was one of the first that was highly competitive, and by that I mean a lot of different groups of people applied for these licenses, and these licenses were fiercely competed for. And our group was fortunate enough to have won more of these licenses, these cannabis licenses, than any other group at the time. And this was back in about 2014, 2015, about maybe 6 months before you and I first met, which was the New York application process. So the real answer is that I started in cannabis, at least in my own heart and mind, back when I was a law clerk, some almost 25 years ago, when I worked for two lawyers who actually represented a man named Ed Rosenthal. And in the cannabis space, Ed Rosenthal is an old, storied OG from the San Francisco Bay Area, who was one of the first cultivators of cannabis. Yeah, Ed's a legend. I saw it pop up there. Yeah, Ed is a legend. Not only was Ed the Ask Ed columnist from High Times magazine, which was the columnist that you could, if you had a crazy mold on your homegrown cannabis that you couldn't identify, Ed would, in his column in High Times magazine every month, give you the answer, a very technical answer for what the problem was. But Ed was also one of the very first to grow cannabis under a legal sanction. So the very first medical marijuana laws were actually municipal ordinances in the Oakland area, and Ed Rosenthal was growing cannabis pursuant to a license given to him by the city of Oakland, because he was growing cannabis, for medical patients. Well, as we know, and as we'll get into, there is a state federal disconnect. And Ed Rosenthal was indicted for essentially trafficking in controlled substances in federal district court in the Northern District of California. And the two lawyers that I was a law clerk for many years ago, um, these lawyers actually represented Ed Rosenthal. And so it was then that I learned that one could be in the cannabis space and be a professional and bring one's talents and skills and aspirations to cannabis. And I find 25 years later that that's still the case. So with that in mind, let's transition into the history of the law of cannabis. So as I touched on, the very first, well, let's go back to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. So that was actually the very first law employed in the United States that addressed marijuana, which at the time was viewed less as a psychoactive that we look at as a pharmacokinetic or something that helps change our emotional state when we consume it, and more of the industrial hemp that we associate with hemp and oils and fibers and those sorts of things. And so they imposed this Tax Act of 1937 as a way to crack down on what was seen at the time as a proliferation of the psychoactive marijuana from places like Mexico and the southern United States. And it also, to Ari's point of how, the enforcement of criminal laws dealing with cannabis were disproportionately meted out to people in communities of color. This was really passed back in 1937 as a way for certain, the federal government to crack down on these communities of color. Particularly, the line that we policymakers in the cannabis space use is that, cannabis marijuana made you look white women in the eye and play jazz music. And, in the eyes of some people in the federal government in those days, that was odious. And so this was really a mechanism a tool to control some of those communities back then. And then we transitioned through to the Controlled Substances Act, which also was a tool for the over enforcement of criminal law associated with cannabis on communities of color. But what the Controlled Substances Act really did is it organized the pharmaceuticals and drugs and other substances that we consume in certain schedules. The Schedule 1 is the most serious schedule and the most highly regulated substances. And of course, given marijuana's history in the country and its political positioning, marijuana was placed in the most serious schedule, Schedule 1. And then there were Schedule 2, which are the drugs that we routinely think of as prescription drugs, and then Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5. Which go down to less controlled substances that are drugs. And so any real credible federal legalization initiative in the current political climate in Washington, D.C. distinguishes between rescheduling cannabis, meaning moving it to one of those different schedules, or descheduling cannabis, pulling it out of the Controlled Substances Act altogether. And the consensus that we're tending to see as laws are introduced or bills are introduced at the federal level to decriminalize cannabis is that they would deschedule or remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. So Ari has up here California Proposition 215, which was some of the very first state medical marijuana laws in the United States. And I spoke about Oakland's ordinance. Oakland's ordinance actually preceded California's Proposition 215 by a few years, but California's Prop 215 was a state law. What I was talking about was a local or municipal, a city ordinance that allowed Ed Rosenthal to grow for medical cannabis patients. And California Prop 215, if you note, it comes in 1996, which was, like I said, several years after Oakland. But the real gist of this is that the first medical marijuana laws in the United States, not only did they originate on the West Coast, which is important, but they also arose out of the AIDS and HIV epidemic, and people who were growing cannabis in the San Francisco Bay Area for friends and family who may have been suffering with symptoms associated with AIDS and HIV. So really, the call for California Proposition 215 was less about social equity, and there it was more about giving people for whom traditional medicine had left them lacking, or was unsatisfying, or was not giving them the relief they needed as they were suffering from serious illnesses. That was really the policy call behind the first cannabis laws in the United States. And then shortly thereafter, Colorado, Washington, they legalized for medical purposes, and then in 2014, of course, Colorado legalized for adult use purposes, and many of the states in the Western United States followed suit. In 2013, the Cole Memorandum is the fourth of a series of guidance documents at the federal level. And for cannabis operators like Ari and myself, and perhaps others, the Cole Memorandum for many years furnished the guidelines that the federal government considered when it decided whether or not to challenge, and by challenge I mean arrest, enforce, indict operators who were growing cannabis under certain state sanctions. So in other words, the Cole Memorandum was this open letter to the 92 or 94 United States attorneys across the country who make decisions about whether to initiate or to not initiate federal law enforcement investigations and prosecutions. And so the Cole Memorandum really set out the principles that the federal government would look to before bringing a case. And so those were things like, does the operator have a state license? And if so, do they discourage, or do they do anything to encourage driving under the influence of alcohol, or not alcohol, of driving under the influence of cannabis? Or do they do the state laws that license these operators, do they deter money laundering activity or cartel activity, or do they encourage the transportation of cannabis from the home state to adjacent states that may not have state laws about cannabis? And so there were 8 or so of those considerations that the federal government laid out. That memorandum has since been withdrawn, but because that memorandum is consistent with how the federal government thinks about prosecutions in general, it still provides good guidance for us. And then, the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment is really that this current iteration of the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, that amendment that we will see in this year's federal spending bill, is really the most concrete protection we have as cannabis operators. And that Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment basically is a provision of the annual spending bill that has to be reviewed every single year. And it basically says that the Department of Justice cannot spend any tax dollars enforcing the Controlled Substance Act against responsibly operating medical marijuana operators, state-sanctioned operators. And that's about as crystal clear guidance as we have at the federal level, protecting us from unwanted intervention by the federal government. So Ari? So the whole gist of what we've been talking about is that there is this almost unique federal state conflict where some 37 or maybe it's 39 states have set up real, true blue, bona fide either medical marijuana laws or adult use recreational cannabis laws. And of course, every state with an adult that sells adult use cannabis, or where adult use cannabis is legal, also has a medical program. But there are 39 of these states now, and yet cannabis is still illegal at the federal level. I one time heard the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, who is an interesting character and who is an advocate of adult use cannabis legalization. He said that it ought to be that if you can get California and South Dakota to agree on anything, it should just be a federal law, right? That should just be the standard. So interestingly, South Dakota, and California both have legalized cannabis. So perhaps it's time at the federal level. But this existence of this federal state dilemma or conflict really creates a tension, because so much of what we as operators do and take for granted is governed or affected by federal law. And so when we are engaged in an activity that is unlawful in the eyes of the feds, it means that a lot of that stuff we take for granted just isn't available to us. So there are a lot of examples that Ari has laid out here in the slide, and I think that they all bear taking a look at. But for example, like just the existence of a 401k plan is super difficult. Why? Because a 401k plan is a creature of the ERISA statute. If any of you have ever heard of the it's an ERISA issue. That's the federal law that governs the workplace and wages and retirement benefits and that sort of thing. And so we've just now, after 7 years of operation, found a 401k plan that we could offer to our employees because they just don't exist in the cannabis space. And so that's just one little example of many where this state federal tension really makes life difficult for operators. Ari's got some good ones here. Punitive taxation, the Internal Revenue Code 280E, and that's something that those of you who are considering whether or not the cannabis space is something that may be an opportunity for you, particularly as a business owner, you have to understand the implication of Internal Revenue Code 280E. And so that's basically a tax penalty in the Internal Revenue Code that says that if your business consists of trafficking in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substances, that you are not allowed to deduct the ordinary and reasonable, or I think ordinary necessary business expenses that other businesses can deduct. So the way it came about was this. Back in the early 80s, there was a big Miami Vice drug dealer with his big cigarette boat, and he got caught on smuggling charges, trafficking charges, and just like the federal government did to Al Capone, they indicted this Miami Vice drug dealer on tax evasion charges. And so while his tax evasion prosecution was going on, he or his lawyer said, "Listen, judge, if you're going to prosecute me for tax evasion, well, I want to make sure, and I want to take this deduction, and I want to take this deduction, and I want to take this deduction." And the judge kind of scratched his chin and said, "You know what? You're right. I'm going to allow this deduction and this deduction and this deduction." And so the very next year, the Congress passed Internal Revenue Code provision 280E to disallow those deductions. And so what that means is that you, if you're a dispensary, the only thing that you can deduct is the cost of goods sold, which is this accounting term of art that really speaks to the costs of your raw materials. So it makes life really hard for somebody who's thinking about being a transporter or thinking about being a dispensary operator. And it's hard for everybody, processors and cultivators too. But what it means is that it's very, very difficult to deduct anything that isn't an actual raw material. And so if you're not manufacturing the product, you are particularly vulnerable to the 280E tax penalty. Banking services, it goes along with that. Just the fact that most banking is regulated at the federal level and not at the state level means that it's not illegal for banks to service the cannabis space, but it means that the risk for them is a lot higher. And so the due diligence, the work that they have to do, ensuring that the transactions that are coming in and going out of their banks are legitimate and not from the illicit market, is a lot steeper. And so it's a lot more expensive. And so banks just choose not to be in the banking space because this federal disconnect makes it so difficult for them to provide banking services to folks who are operators. advertising, real estate challenges, pesticides and quality assurance. Pesticides are also governed under federal law, and so there are no label provisions on the labels of pesticides that say this is for use on cannabis. And because the label is the law in the pesticide world, there really aren't pesticides built for cannabis. Quality assurance and consumer protection standards. While many states have very, very strong quality assurance and consumer protection standards, and by that I'm talking about like labeling and packaging and sealing the products and that sort of thing, they're not consistent from state to state to state. And so that's the role of the federal government, to make these consistent so that we can have a more national marketplace. All right. So currently in the pipeline, there are a handful of federal bills that would change the status of cannabis as you know, at the federal level, the legal status of cannabis. Some are probably more viable than others, and so rather than just ticking them off, here's what we think is going on in Washington, D.C. right now. So New York Senator Chuck Schumer and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker and Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, all of whom have some status in the Senate based on their longevity in their particular chairs, their positions. They have indicated that they are it's a priority for them to advance federal cannabis legalization reform. They've said that it's something that they, you know, earlier this year they said they'd get to it this year. Now they're saying it's that kind of maybe a next year thing, and so nobody really knows exactly when they are going to advance this. But what they have done is they have drafted a big comprehensive federal law, and they didn't introduce it, but what they did is they released it to the public for comment, and they've solicited comment from stakeholders who wanted to comment on their particular act. And then now they have this next draft that they're working on that they are telling everybody they're going to introduce and see if they can get to pass. I think the conventional wisdom is that you know, cannabis legalization, whether you're for it or you're against it, and I presume most of the people on here are for it, but you know, it's still a big weighty issue. And while I am the most fulsome advocate you'd ever want to come into contact with, I still understand that reasonable people might disagree with me on whether or not cannabis ought to be legalized. And so, you know, there are still a lot of people, many of whom are older, more conservative senators from more conservative states, but there are people in the Congress who are still uncomfortable with the notion of the legalization of cannabis. And so it's thought that this Booker Wyden Schumer bill is probably contains too much to be really viable to pass. However, once they've worked their bill through Congress, then there may be room in the vacuum or the shadow of that for a more slimmed down version of some sort of federal legalization initiative, whether that's simply, you know, helping with the expungements and the social equity pieces and also the banking and economic pieces, and maybe that's it, or maybe it's something else. So I think that the next real chance for I think what we will see in the short term, meaning in the next 3 to 12 months, is some little tiny fixes that help us advance maybe research or veterans access, perhaps some banking. But I think the next real opportunity for fulsome, you know, comprehensive federal, you know, legalization overhaul is probably in 2023 when they have to redo the Farm Bill again, because that's a natural place for cannabis legalization to go. All right.
Jeremy, thank you. Before I let you go, and you're invited to stay if your schedule permits till
Sure.
7:15, where we're going to do some Q&A
Yep.
with you and Nigas. But any resources that you can point folks to if they want to learn more about what's happening with federal legislation in Washington, D.C., understand the legal background, or get involved as an advocate? Because I think we have a lot of advocates here joining us on Zoom.
Yeah, so I think there's some like quick stuff that you can do. Send an email. Cannabis in Common is an interesting one that we've recently been associated with. That's the one that Seth Rogen and Sarah Silverman are behind, and it's just literally, it's not about doing it, legalizing cannabis this way or legalizing cannabis that way, or it's just about get something over the finish line and raise the issue to our stakeholders in Washington D.C. So that's a good one. I think that tuning into some of the cannabis periodicals, the trade journals like marijuanamoment.net is one where you get a lot of very, very fresh information about what's going on in Washington D.C. and at the states. I think that the MJ Business Daily also is a good place, a good resource. I know that the Times Union is trying to spin up a cannabis focused arm. I think that I think an incubator like this is really the modern way of getting involved in the cannabis space, because you're building that base of knowledge in advance of this huge opportunity that everybody has in New York. And so I think paying attention to what's going on in the media is how you figure out how you engage, because each of us engages with cannabis differently. Like, some of us are advocates, home grow, free the weed. Others of us are entrepreneurs and want to be in from a business perspective. Others have very, very strong opinions about restorative justice and expungements and certificates of relief from disability. So it's about figuring out where those channels are to engage. And I think tapping into the media is the best way to do it.
Excellent. Jeremy, thank you so much. And I look forward to the Q&A period with you in a few minutes. We are now moving on to MRTA 101, the policies shaping New York's $5 billion adult use market. And we have an absolutely wonderful panelist, cannabis expert, and a good friend, Nigas. Thank you so much for joining us. Nigas serves as the Vice President of Public Policy for Columbia Care, and she's also the President of the New York Medical Cannabis Industry Association. And we've had the pleasure to work together on many different things over the years. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks for the invite. And Jeremy, good to see you. And it's been wonderful to listen in on everything so far.
And, similar to what I asked Jeremy, what is such a wonderful and impressive individual like yourself? How did you make your way to the cannabis industry?
I know. My mom and I joke about this all the time, because she's like, could you imagine at 8 having grown up being like, I want to work in cannabis policy? And here we are. And I will say, I don't think, when I was in school, jobs like this didn't exist. I didn't know that I could want it, but I'm not terribly surprised to find myself here, because first of all, this is about as cool as policy gets, but like about as nerdy as cannabis gets, just shy of insurance. I've decided, but with some people who run cannabis insurance companies, we've decided that is definitely nerdier than policy. But honestly, I think working in cannabis and cannabis policy specifically is really exciting if you like policy, because you're not just talking about cannabis. It's about cannabis, it's about criminal justice reform, it's about healthcare policy, it's about economic development, it's land use. It's so many different aspects of policy, but through one specific lens. And then you add on the cannabis part. And frankly, I think that this is one of the most exciting places to get to work, because you can be really creative, because we really don't have, none of the existing policy frameworks we have are 100% right for cannabis. And so you get to be really creative and learning from what we have and haven't done. And I think in states like New York, we get to really define and imagine what it looks like to create equitable policy, and to think through what it means to not just pass a law, but to think through all of the consequences of that law, and prepare to make sure that you are actually repairing past harms, that you are creating an opportunity for people who didn't have it before, and that you're correcting some of the past injustices we've had as a country. And that's a really exciting place to get to work. And I'm honored to be here, even if I definitely didn't have this in my 10-year plan when I was a 22-year-old and did things like have 10-year plans.
Well, it is an absolute pleasure. I turn it over to you to walk us through the MRTA and other policy issues. But a real pleasure to have you here this evening, Angus. Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. I'm excited to be here. So I'll go ahead and skip to the next slide and dive straight into the Empire State of Cannabis, which I think one of the things that's most important to recognize about New York is that it already is the largest cannabis market on the East Coast, and it will remain the largest cannabis market. And I don't think it's just about the size and scale. It also, is really setting the tone for a lot of parts of East Coast cannabis culture. And I think that you see in the MRTA and in the comprehensive nature of the MRTA. But these numbers here run the total market size. And in particular, I want to talk about the difference between the total market and the regulated market, because one of the challenges and opportunities in cannabis legalization is that we already have robust illicit market or unregulated market or legacy market, whichever word you'd like to use. We have a robust legacy economy happening around cannabis already. And the challenges with legalizing it is, how do you incentivize folks to leave legacy and enter legal, so that you can start having businesses become, safe from certain types of enforcement actions. And also, the making sure that we're all being good corporate citizens and paying our taxes and ensuring consumer safety and ensuring there's accountability so that consumers can know when they have an unsafe product, things like that, that sometimes are happening in the legacy market, but aren't necessarily happening in systemic and accessible ways, the way we see in other markets like, apples or tomatoes, or alcohol and tobacco. So I think that gap you see between the total market size and the regulated market size is really key, because even if adult use sales were turned on today immediately through some imaginary network of retailers and suppliers, most folks will end up on day one still in the illicit market, because that's what's available and that's what's known to them. And one of the biggest challenges we have in turning on a legal market is moving the supply and being able to meet demand through legal channels, because it takes time to establish them. And in particular, it takes time for regulators to be able to issue licenses and actually regulate and to collect taxes and everything from a market. So that growth from 1.2 billion to 4.2 billion that we see for the regulated market size, even by 2027, that's still leaving over $1 billion of legacy market activity. I raise that in part because there's also a huge amount of growth that's going to happen. And especially once you see legal sales start, we know that some of the fastest growing consumer demographics, for example, are women over 55. And there are folks who are not necessarily currently participating in cannabis, experiences, who will be adding to the broader economic pool, which is why you also see that growth in the total market size from 23 to 27. I think the last thing while we're here, I just want to kind of speak to the tax revenue, cultivation, and retail licenses. Right now in New York, it's anticipated that the mature market, which is what we'll call the 2027 projections, would have up to 900 retail licenses. I think one thing that we kind of expect to see is that those licenses aren't going to be issued all at once, in part because, especially once we start talking about the equity programs in a slide or two, if you release all of the licenses at once and you haven't got an equity right, you can't take licenses back. And so being able to issue the licenses incrementally so that we can make sure we're actually hitting the equity goals that are established in the MRTA is part of why that type of incremental issuance is really important, so that you have time to adapt your policy strategies in order to actually achieve your legislative intent. And that does just take time and feedback and, frankly, court cases and things like that. Similarly, I think we all expect cultivation space to increase. The one thing that's not present here is what the impacts of federal legalization could do. And Jeremy just spoke to a lot of that. I think one of the important things, because there's a lot about federal legalization that's very exciting and important, but one thing that's key for a new market like New York is being able to have enough time for the state program to actually issue licenses and to build the program that New York State wants to see. Because, we have spent what, 3, 4, 5 years just working on passing something like the MRTA, and to have interstate commerce turned on, tomorrow could be devastating to some of these new programs that are trying to bring equity and establish, homegrown local cannabis businesses within each state. And so I think that's something that we have to keep in mind when we look at those projections towards 2027. And that's just in the medium term. In 20 years from now, who knows what cannabis cultivation is going to look like. I don't even want to try to predict that. It's hard enough trying to predict the next month in cannabis. So we go ahead and move on to the next slide, and let's talk about some of the specifics in the MRTA. So the MRTA establishes a regulator. It establishes the Office of Cannabis Management, which is currently led by Chris Alexander. And then it also created a cannabis control board, which oversees and which the OCM reports to, which is chaired by Tremaine Wright. I think one of the trickiest parts, that's definitely one of the wonkiest parts of turning on legal sales or establishing any type of legal cannabis market, is the time it takes to both find knowledgeable, passionate regulators. I think New York is very lucky to have found somebody who knows this very well and genuinely wants to see these programs succeed. And then also being able to staff that, right? Like for every regulation, there needs to be a team of people ready to help, implement it. Somebody who has to review products and people who have to know what the product labeling rules are. And we know that that's one of the biggest challenges, is being able to hire and staff brand new agencies with all these people you need who will be knowledgeable and effective in their jobs. So the governance is established. Like, we have to give props to the new administration for the work that's happened, because there was a lot that was stalled earlier this year. And that's led to delays in things like personal cultivation for patients. We've seen some regs come out. We expect to see some more movement on establishing those personal cultivation rules for patients, and hopefully soon after that for everyone. I think that might be included in some of what's being proposed right now. But New York has established personal cultivation, and some of those regs are up for discussion right now. New York was also proactive in establishing public consumption guidelines and licensing, but also most importantly, I think one of the things that the MRTA got very, very right was making it clear that you can consume cannabis wherever you can consume a cigarette. And that is a huge piece on equity, because anybody who lives in federally subsidized housing or with landlords who don't permit cannabis, especially inhaled cannabis consumption, could be risking their housing if they were to smoke inside of their own home. And so being able to make public consumption more acceptable, that was also key in addressing those arrest disparities that Ari opened with at the beginning of the section of tonight. Because so much of that was around somebody, being stopped and frisked and then having a small amount of cannabis on their person, or somebody who might have been smoking outside. And it might have, the smell was used as probable cause. And so normalizing public consumption is not just helpful equity policy, but I also think it's part of just the overall ending of the stigmatization around cannabis too, and feeling more comfortable treating it like any other adult intoxicant that can be responsibly consumed. All right, local opt-out was another key part of the MRTA, and was also very exciting because it was done every time we pass a cannabis bill, we all get a little better at writing them. And one of the things that's changed with local opt-out over time is you've seen a model that goes, from Colorado and California with those original ballot referendums that basically let each location or city, town, or county determine whether or not they would legalize cannabis. Whereas now that we're further along, states like New York are establishing local opt-out in a way that makes it very difficult for a town supervisor board of 5 to call a meeting and let 3 people determine whether or not cannabis will be sold. So what happened in New York was that you have to not just have a vote for your town or city or village government to whether or not to opt out, but if your town government votes to opt out, that then triggers a local referendum process. So in New York, all of the places that will be doing local opt-out have typically, I believe most of them have already had their votes. Anybody who wanted to have their vote as part of the November election last week had to have voted on it last July. Ari, do you know offhand roughly how many localities are currently looking at opt-out?
I don't have that number. It's
It's
a good question. I will try to get that number and share it with folks. But I did want to add to what you said, and correct me if you have a different understanding, Nigist, is that the local opt-out is exclusively to retail.
yes,
And
retail and social consumption venues.
okay, but in terms of cultivation facilities or processing facilities, no locality, my understanding, can opt out from that.
Correct. And
Okay.
that was also an important part because if you have a farm somewhere and you're already growing hemp or you were planning on being able to open, like you can't move your farm. Like if that's where your land is, that's where your land is. And I think being able to focus opt out just on retail and consumption, and localities could even separate those out, I believe, and choose to vote yes for retail and no for consumption space too. So I think
Yeah.
that narrowing it down, making it very specific, and then there was a deadline. Like you have to decide, I think, by the end of this calendar year, if you're going to run a referendum process on this. And so each of those steps, right, you have to vote, but then there's a referendum and you have to pick retail or consumption. Each of those steps helps ensure that just a few local elected officials can't determine the policy for the entire town.
And Niggas, just one more question on this, because I know a lot of entrepreneurs are thinking about real estate and locations. We have a question from John that came through the Q&A. Will those places that have that opted out have an opportunity to opt back in at a future date?
Yes. So if you have opted out, you can reverse an opt out. If you have opted in, that's done. Like once you opt in, you've opted in and you can't undo an opt in, which also makes sense because once you opt in and you've got people with licenses and things like that, we don't want like towns reversing decisions and dismantling businesses. So it can be undone. And I suspect like in New Jersey right now, a lot of towns have opted out. There's a very firm expectation that many places will opt in as soon as they have a better understanding of how some of this is going to be implemented. And I think in New York, just because a place is opted out right now doesn't mean they can't be reversed later.
Thank you.
And doesn't even mean that you might still have time to reverse that before some of these licenses get issued. Hopefully not. Hopefully licenses come much sooner than that. Moving on to taxation, which let me make sure I pull up my notes on that. New York has an interesting setup. It's got a pretty high total effective tax rate, not quite as high as California, but kind of a little bit on the higher end, which includes a potency tax. So it has one of the a per milligram of THC potency tax with different rates for flower, concentrates, and edibles. That's on top of a 9% retail sales tax and an additional 4% tax for localities. And that 4%, 1%, I believe, goes to the county, and 3% gets divided up proportionally among the towns and villages that have cannabis dispensaries. So if a locality has opted out, they have also opted out of cannabis tax revenue, which is another excellent incentive for local governments to opt in. But also makes it clear that if you as a local government have decided to allow cannabis business in, you're going to get your cannabis tax revenue for the work you've done, for your local regulations and for welcoming business and economic opportunity into your town. And then lastly, where does this money go once it's collected? I already alluded to where some of it goes back to local governments, but most of the tax revenue gets divided up after covering the cost of the regulator between two core funds, the Community Grants Reinvestment Fund and the Drug Treatment and Public Education Fund. The second fund makes it sounds pretty straightforward, public education, especially around responsible consumption. I think this is one area where prevention is much more effective than penalization, and making sure that adult consumers know how to responsibly store their product and how to understand cannabis impairment before driving and things like that is going to go a long way. And the Reinvestment Fund, though, is, I think, one of the more exciting ones, because that's where we start to see loans, like low to no interest loans that could be issued to social equity entrepreneurs, as well as grants that are supposed to go back towards the communities that were disproportionately impacted by cannabis enforcement. And so I think, in New York or in Illinois, they have a comparable fund called the R3 Fund, and it's just started issuing, I think, millions of dollars of grants last quarter, and is continuing to redistribute the cannabis tax revenue that's been collected so far towards community nonprofits focused on undoing the harms from the war on drugs. Thanks, Ari. So let's get into some of the exciting stuff. And I think this is another area where New York did like a really fantastic job thinking about just a comprehensive list of different types of licenses. Nursery licenses aren't particularly common in a lot of cannabis legalization. They typically come later, and New York is starting off right by having a diverse array. Now, a lot of these are pretty straightforward, so I'll speak a little bit to the high points around some of the more specific ones. Like a cooperative is a specific type of cultivation experience, which I believe cannot sell or distribute its goods, but is meant to be a group of folks who are growing together. And I think you can come on site to be able to like purchase something from a co-op, but I don't believe you can, like a co-op can distribute to other retailers. A micro business is exactly what it sounds like, around some of the smaller options for entering the cannabis space, which is especially important for folks who want to enter with low capital costs and using the resources they have, and then hopefully iterate their business and expand if they want to, or keep their micro business if that's what works for them. Delivery, we fully expect to be huge. New York City, I think, is the cannabis delivery capital of the world right now, especially, and if it wasn't before or after COVID, it definitely is. And I think what's been done with delivery is really unique for New York. I believe it's capped, a delivery license is capped at 25 employees. And the expectation was to make this one of the easiest entry points for folks who want to leave the legacy market and enter the legal industry. Now on this, I'm going to kind of reiterate one of the things that Jeremy raised around 280E taxation. I think delivery and retail dispensaries are definitely two business license classes that get hardest by 280E and the very high effective federal taxation rate. And that's where all I'll say at this point, because I know there's lots of good stuff and you already talked about business plans, but one of the things that I always tell folks who are aspiring to get into this industry is like, one, make your business plan with a cannabis accountant, somebody who understands all of the specifics of what costs are going to come, and then make your plan and then make it 50% worse and make the timeline twice as long, because you need to account for your worst case scenario needs to be pretty bad, because between litigation and some of these uncertainties, you want to be prepared for the very worst so that when we only get the middle worst, you're ready to survive that. The nursery is, I think, really exciting in terms of being able to have a specific license type devoted to creating multiple types of cannabis genetics. And I'm excited to see the businesses that come up through that. And social use is exactly what you might expect, which is these consumption lounge spaces and things like that. I think that, as you might expect, we fully anticipate to see a lot of cultivator, processor, retail types of licenses coming on fast in roughly that order, because that's kind of the bare minimum you need to be able to start selling cannabis legally. But we still don't know yet exactly how these license types are going to get rolled out, what are the different types of application requirements and how they'll be awarded and things like that. And that's where I'll echo what Jeremy said towards the end of his remarks around finding your reputable news sources and following the conversation. And that includes going straight to the regulator. The Office of Cannabis Management is working very hard to make their meetings very public and to make information accessible. And so just be aware of when those meetings are happening, track when these regulations are released, and follow them, because there are a lot of details still to be determined that will that you can have influence over to make sure that your business and your cannabis approach will be successful.
And Nigas, just on the licenses, we have a question from Janet. What type of license would a restaurant with infused food and drink be in? What type of category does that sound like to you?
That sounds like social use, but it would that to me sounds like social use. It will depend on how they define social use, and it will depend on how they define some of the processor stuff, because are you infusing it on site, and are you going to be allowed to do on-site infusion? Those are questions that we're still waiting to have answered.
Thank you.
All right, equity, which is one of the things I get most excited about in cannabis. So social equity in the New York MRTA has a lot of interesting categories in it. There's obviously the communities disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, which is a multi-part definition that includes having a past, or I think also being related to, like directly related to somebody with a past cannabis conviction, living in a disproportionately impacted geographical area, which is still to be determined, and being at 80% of your area mean income. And so it's all three of those at once in order to be in that category, I believe. The second one is minority and women-owned businesses, and then distressed farmers, which I think was an important addition for especially some of our upstate agricultural communities, and then service-disabled veterans. And I think these were all very carefully chosen to be specific. And I think that there's also additional weighting around the social equity categories around disproportionately impacted, and then the other kind of economic equity, the other three kind of economic equity categories that already exist, and are already defined in other parts of New York State code. But all of these combined, the MRTA very thoughtfully does not set a quota. Apologies for our special guest here. It's pets o'clock at the Abebe household. In addition to just making these definitions, the MRTA doesn't put a target or a quota, but makes it clear that there's an expectation or an intent that roughly 50% of these licenses will be distributed to folks who meet these definitions of social and economic equity. It still remains to be seen, is that 50% in each license category? Is it 50% of all licenses total? That can be interpreted in many ways, but it was very cleverly and importantly written vaguely, because you cannot, one, there's all sorts of stuff with affirmative action and other types of lawsuits that have been settled around different ways to address inequitable outcomes in past policy that make it clear that you can't have quotas or set-asides. Ohio had a recent, has perhaps the most recent example in cannabis specifically, but we've seen others in other industries and settings. But that leads me to just a broader point, which is the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, means that we cannot do set-asides or set targets based specifically on race, gender, or other immutable characteristics like that. And so we have to look at things like that definition for a disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, knowing that certain parts of certain New Yorkers were disproportionately impacted by enforcement, setting the criteria that matches the things that inform that disproportionate enforcement helps ensure that this definition can withstand any court challenges from folks who are trying to undermine, or folks who disagree with those equity goals. Excuse me. The equity goals set out by the legislators. Let's go ahead and next slide, Ari. So I alluded to the Reinvestment Fund earlier. The MRTA creates expectations, one, around setting up these startup loans to help ensure early access to capital, which is definitely one of the most challenging aspects for new businesses in cannabis. And I always remind folks that Black women receive less than half of a percentage point of venture capital funds in the normal economy. And that's with just like a normal, regular business. When you start talking about cannabis business, those capital hurdles increase exponentially for everyone who is not a white man. And so, because it's hard to access capital, even if you are a white man in cannabis. So those startup loans that we're seeing states roll out are really important for addressing some of those inequities. They also will not, in and of themselves, be enough to finance the early stage of the cannabis industry. And so how these loans get structured, I hope we start to see more innovative policy that uses these loans as leverage against private capital to incentivize early stage investments in new licensees. In addition to that access to certain state-run startup loan programs, priority licensing, which typically manifests as a window of time where the only licenses being issued are around these equity criteria. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, he's being extremely rude today. Is where social equity license applicants are the only applicant candidates being considered for a period of time, and they're getting issued first, which allows for two things. One, time to build out the business, but also time for the regulator to be able to focus on investing in the early stages and making sure these businesses come online successfully. And one of the ways the regulator can support that will be through incubator programs. One, not all of them rely on the regulator. You have this one right here with the OG Accelerator. That's definitely not relying on the regulator to just get right ahead and make sure that folks know how to enter the space. And I think we'll continue to see different types of programming like this coming unbidden, but I look forward to what we can do even more when we have some good public-private partnerships with the regulator to keep expediting this, market expansion, legal market expansion. But I'll go ahead and stop there because I feel like Q&A is always the best part, and hopefully I'm confident this group will have lots of good ones.
Wow, Nigas, that was absolutely terrific. And of course, we welcome both Yuman and other participants to this Zoom webinar on cannabis. And thank you. That was really great. I want to encourage everyone to use the Zoom Q&A function to ask questions both of Nigist and Jeremy. And I already see some great questions flowing in. I'm going to read a question from Seth Wiesel, who says, on one hand, I encourage the Schumer bill to legalize cannabis and get it off Schedule 1, but it seems that a lot of the purpose of this bill is to allow the federal government to tax cannabis. If this bill passes, will anyone be able to make a profit between the state and federal taxes? That's a good and interesting question from Seth, and I'll really open it up, Jeremy, to yourself or Nigist to respond to Seth's question.
Yeah, this is Jeremy. I think that's a great point. I can't remember exactly what the effective tax rate in the Booker-Schumer-Wyden bill was. We call that the CAO Act. So if I say CAO Act, I'm talking about that Booker-Wyden-Schumer bill, and perhaps Nigist recalls. But most of the trade associations or advocacy groups that pay attention to cannabis in Washington, D.C., whether it was NORML or Drug Policy Alliance or the United States Cannabis Council or the National Cannabis Business Association or whomever, many of them agreed that the tax rate was too high. And so my sense from just reading the bill was that they were working more to create a structure for implementing a tax that looks like alcohol, with like bonded warehouses and things like that, things that they implemented in alcohol laws back right after they repealed prohibition. So my sense was that they were trying to recreate a structure like that, and that the actual number, the amount of tax, is probably subject to typical legislative negotiation. But it certainly was an issue almost universally, the amount of tax, because it really didn't take into account the taxes that are already imposed at the state level. Illinois is one example where the effective tax rate is about 30%. Other tax rates,
Yeah.
range from about 11 to 30 is kind of high. So,
But no, thank you for that, Jeremy. And without
yeah.
getting too technical, eliminating the 280E punitive taxation will also allow for there to be, will create downward pressure on prices and will allow some extra room for taxes. So it's an interesting and complicated discussion, but the important thing to remember, and I think this was Jeremy's last point, is that the higher and more aggressive states and the feds get on tax, that actually allows the illicit market to continue to thrive because of that spread. And so there are no free lunches when it comes to taxes. We have a great question coming in from Daniel, who thanks everyone for participating in the event, but also points out that the 10 kind of legacy companies in the medical cannabis market, Nigas works for Columbia Care, Jeremy for PharmaCann. I've previously been affiliated and worked for 2 of the companies. These are on average larger companies. So, the question is, how are entrepreneurs who are not massive multi-billion-dollar public companies going to be able to compete in the future adult use market? Do they have a chance?
I love taking this question because, yes, let me tell you, there is plenty of room. And I know this because we commissioned a study to demonstrate just how little of the very large $4-5+ billion New York market that ROs can absorb in right away. That said, allowing sales to start early has a few benefits for everyone. One, it dramatically helps the medical program, which has been limping along in New York for 5 years. As long as it's been established, we only got whole flower, I think, last week on the shelves in the New York market. And as a point of comparison, Virginia, that bastion of progressive liberal policy, was able to get whole flower on the shelves less than 9 months after the first dispensary opened its doors. So the New York medical program has struggled to actually establish itself. There's only 100,000 patients in Florida, which started about the same time and is about the same size as New York, has 400,000. So allowing earlier adult use sales provides a lot of support for a medical program that's been limping along for a while.
Thank you.
The other more important part of it, or not more important, but another important part of turning on sales is it starts generating tax revenue so that by the time those first social equity licenses are getting issued, there are actually funds to use for loans and grants to those new entrepreneurs, because New York is in a very difficult and unsustainable budget deficit problem right now. And in order for innovative programming like loans to social equity entrepreneurs to happen, it needs to be paid for in advance. And allowing the medical operators to start sales means you can start generating tax revenue in order to meet those priorities. And lastly, we do know from the economic analysis we've done that the most the ROs could absorb from the large amount of legacy market activity that's happening in New York is maybe 5 to 10% of the market. And so I would strongly encourage aspiring entrepreneurs to understand that the medical operators are not the primary source of competition at this point in time. The most difficult source of competition will be trying to outcompete an unregulated market that does not have to deal with testing or testing backlogs, that doesn't have to deal with the taxes that we have just talked about, that does not have to worry about 280E compliance and some of these other things. And so we've already seen in Rolling Stone and other places, other outlets, folks in the legacy market making it very clear that they're not in a rush to run into the legal market. And that's a rational choice. It's not necessarily the choice everyone wants to make, but there is a certain logic to that right now because of how difficult it can be to operate in the legal side. I think, though, it is worthwhile to make that transition because the potential that is going to be coming and also the freedom that comes from not risking law enforcement actions is absolutely worth it for folks who are considering that transition from legacy to legal. And we will need everyone, and we will need a market that can facilitate those transitions for everyone.
Thank you, Nigus. We have so many questions rolling in, so I'm going to ask Nigus and Jeremy just to keep it to 30 seconds, rapid responses, so that we can get to questions. I see a question coming in from Darian, who says that the chairperson, Chairwoman Wright, has said of the OCM, of the Office of Cannabis Management, has said that there's an 18 months is the deadline for regulations. Does that mean that that's when they'll release the cannabis applications or award licenses?
Yeah, this is
don't
Jeremy.
know.
I heard her statement was that adult use licenses wouldn't be issued until spring of 2023. That's what I heard. Yeah.
Mhm. Go ahead, Jeremy.
No, and so to me, if I had to kind of read the tea leaves of what that statement meant, it means that between now and spring of 2023, they'll have to come up with the regulations, the application process, and then actually issue that application and get those application submissions in, and then score and award those by that time period. That, to me, that's what that time period means.
Thank you. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty. Going on to the next question, thank you, Jeremy, from Damon. Why are the application and registration fees so high in New York State? And is there a way around fully paying for them?
Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe the application fees have been set yet for adult use licenses, possibly for the medical expansion on the horizon. And I think on the medical side, it's because this program, the medical program, was designed years ago before there was like a real understanding of equity and fees being incorporated into policy. And I think that I would say I fully expect, given who we have as regulators in the board, that there will be some options for social equity and economic equity applicants to have reduced fee options or resources for grants to cover those fees.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Richard. This is directed to you, Nigus. Could you repeat the 3 criteria for disproportionately impact by cannabis prohibition of social equity licenses?
Sure. One is that you're making 80% of your what's called AMI, or area mean income, which you have to look up based off of where you currently live. The other is that you live within a to be determined disproportionately impacted area, meaning you are in an area that meets certain statistical criteria for being over policed or having been disproportionately impacted by prohibition enforcement. And then I think the third and final criteria is that you or a direct relation of yours, like a child, sibling, or spouse, had a cannabis conviction.
Thank you. Question for you, Jeremy. Would state chartered banks be somewhat more receptive to cannabis businesses than federally chartered banks?
Yes, that is true, but it's not because banks are federally chartered and others are state chartered. It's that state chartered banks tend to be smaller and therefore more open to the risk of banking a cannabis operator than a nationally chartered bank.
Thank you. Nigus, from Christine, without the regulations out and in place, I'm finding it difficult to think ahead and writing a detailed business plan. Should we be looking at other states like Massachusetts to help us write a sound plan? And what advice do you have for us?
So I think there are certain aspects of a plan that will be universally applicable. And I would say at this point, write as much as you can that you know will be evergreen, and just be ready to edit and revise as we all get more clarity ahead.
Hey, and let me add
Please.
something there, that in some states, particularly those states with competitive licensing processes, there you may be able to find copies of other business plans or other components of applications from which you can start to model your own.
And we have one more question from Rajan, who is asking if anyone can speak to the gifting controversy that's been unfolding recently. Nigus or Jeremy, do either of you want to take that?
Sure.
Well, I just, go ahead, Nigus.
Go ahead. Oh.
No, you.
I'm sure we're both so excited for this one. I think the bill made it pretty clear, and this has been coming up in a lot of states where people are trying to not replicate what has happened in DC. which is making sure that it is okay to share the same way. If I came over to Ari's house and split a 6-pack of beer with him, that is a legal way to share my alcohol, but it is not legal to provide remuneration for something else and then just so happen to be gifting cannabis according to a very specific fee schedule. And as somebody who has lived in DC and near it and has seen very, very popular so-called digital subscriptions be used, this is, it's not within the bounds of the law as it was currently written.
It's a challenge because there's this regulatory vacuum where the state has legalized cannabis, but it hasn't really set up a framework for how you grow it and how you purchase it and how you process it. And so there's this vacuum that is created that between those that we're seeing play out in New York even.
Excellent. We have more questions rolling in, but we're going to have to say goodbye at this point. Jeremy and Nigist, can't thank you enough for sharing your passion and expertise with us. Eric, can't thank you and the Kauffman Incubator and Binghamton University enough for convening this amazing group. As you guys know, this is the first session of 4. We're going to be right back here next week on Tuesday evening at 5:30 p.m. We have wonderful speakers lined up. We have Eric Greenbaum from Vireo Health, the Chief Science Officer, to walk through cultivation and processing parts of the supply chain. We have a state senator State Senator Cooney from Rochester of the 56th District is going to be joining us. Later on, perhaps tomorrow, we will share the recording of this session with you. You will have access to the presentation, to the notes, and you will also see in the notes some suggested readings if you want to dig a little deeper, if you want to read all 150 plus pages of the MRTA, you will have links to that. So really want to thank everyone for taking the time from their extraordinary busy schedules to think about opportunities in the cannabis industry here in New York, and really to thank all of our supporters and particularly our panelists. Again, Nigis and Jeremy, thank you everyone, and we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday evening next week. And thank you again, Eric. Take care, folks.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Ari.
Good luck. Thanks, Ari.
Take care, guys. A real pleasure. Have a wonderful evening.